Ruth, what does the flyer say? Other side.
37.
37. Okay. I want to thank everyone for coming. My name is Richard, and we're going to just do a couple minutes of logistics and last-minute announcements. So with that, Mercury, you have something you'd like to share with everyone. So come on up. And then I'll just put the microphone right here.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mercury, and I produce a Star Trek themed burlesque show. It's happening on July 11th at the Complex in Glendale, and I'm just going to hand out some flyers if anyone is interested in coming. We would love to see you there. So I'm just going to try and hand out some flyers. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Live long and prosper.
Actually heard of it.
Yeah, it's our second one.
Okay, so I want to get started. Let me give me a flyer. Okay, so let's just take a second to familiarize ourselves with this flyer, which I've gone to the trouble of making. A lot of Marathon essentials, what is lava, how to contact us, how to get on the mailing list, what this Sunday Salon is about. This is the 37th. In our Salon series, we've been at Figaro almost 18 months. We used to be at Clifton's Cafeteria, God rest its soul. Scaffolding is off down the street. I have a walking tour. I have a free Broadway walking tour. It's the Broadway Online Line series, which I've been running for 18 months since the city announced its plan to destroy Broadway with the Broadway Streetscape Master Plan, which is in the end of Phase 1, Strategy 1, and I have just had confirmation from 5 officials in Public Works that there is no more public comment being taken on the Broadway Master Streetscape Plan. 2009 was it. So if you didn't have anything to say 5 years ago, it's barreling along. But you can send Jose Rizar an email, and I don't know, I'm a little concerned. Anyway, so my walking tour will be at the end of this event. We have 2 talks today. My walking tour will start at 2:30. Our event will end around 2:15. I'm going to get Milt up in just a second. He's going to stay there. I want to get started with this. That will be our first talk. He's going to talk about science fiction. Our second talk is going to be about another big science fiction fan who is intrinsically connected to the association that Milt belongs to, and that is Jack Parsons. And Craig is back there. Craig, you're going to come up in about an hour and get us started on Jack Parsons and the world of science fiction, Aleister Crowley, the Ordo Templi Orientis, and the rocket science. We're not going to have a discussion of what an integral is, though, are we?
Well, not unless
Okay, right. So we will be available to answer maybe what an integral is, which is how they invented it, solid rocket fuel. We won't talk about that explicitly. So, Bill, why don't I move the microphone and get the slide back up to the first one? And you're going to talk about 20 important science fiction writers. People. Perfect. Okay, great. So let's get started. Milt will talk for about 45 minutes, then we'll have a break, and people can get coffee or a sandwich, and we'll get started again at 1 with Craig, and let me move this, and we'll get started, and I'll be. So just tell me when you want to do the slide. Just say next, and I'll do that.
I figure
Yeah. This is nice.
I figure if I'm going to be talking for most of an hour, I'll be seated rather than standing. My name's Milt Stevens. I'm an exceedingly long-time science fiction fan. I joined the Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society 54 years ago. And since then, I've had all sorts of encounters with people in the science fiction field. Everything from talking to them to waking up the next morning under the carpet with them. So I know quite a bit about science fiction writing. How this particular presentation was put together a couple of years ago, there was a exhibit at Cal State Northridge. It was in one of the library's exhibit halls from September to the following June. And as part of that, we wanted to show what some of the major science fiction figures of the 20th century look like. Surprisingly, they look pretty much like Terran Homo sapiens. A few are a little but none with 2 heads or anything like that. So we put that together. The final list was kicked around a lot because depending on what way you want to go, I'll write for the whole century. Well, H.G. Wells was writing in the early part of the century, but we didn't have any photos of him. Others, if we wanted to go more into fantasy, of course, it's Tolkien, Robert E. Howard, and H.P. Lovecraft. We decided to keep it more in the lines of science fiction, even though some of these writers have written quite good fantasy as well. We also decided to only use deceased authors because the Special Collections Librarian at Northridge had done this sort of thing before, and she was a little bit worried about living writers coming in and saying, why aren't I on the list? And therefore, we could say, but all of these people are deceased. Do you wish to join them? That we get past that argument. But, so, we did it, and this is the list we finally came up with. This isn't quite, well, in one sense it is the beginning, but it's not the first slide.
Is that?
The other way, well, let's
You
see.
skipped ahead one.
No, that's it.
No?
This is the first slide.
This is the first slide?
Yeah.
Well, okay, I can play it from here because in a very real sense, this is the beginning of science fiction as we know it. This is Hugo Gernsback. And he got the idea of publishing the first science fiction magazine, Amazing Stories. Prior to that, he had his publishing company was called Experimenter Publishing. And it published things like the Radio Experimenter and the Electrical Experimenter, and they were sort of like the popular science type publications. He stayed in publishing for a very long time after Amazing Stories, and eventually published a very successful publication called Sexology. And for all I know, that may be still around. It was last time some years back, but it was an academic consideration of sex and all its ramifications. It wasn't a prurient interest type publication. But anyway, in 1926, he got the idea of, he published a few science fiction stories in his other magazine. He wanted to bring out a magazine which he wanted to call Scientifiction, because the term science fiction hadn't been invented yet. Generally, such things were called scientific romances. But he did a trial with the idea of science fiction, and it didn't go over. So, in April 1926, he brought out the first issue of Amazing Stories. And it was trying for scientific reputability, that it wasn't as strange as it looked. It featured covers by Frank R. Poul, who was a first-rate artist in the 20s and 30s, and had a lot of translations of European science fiction. Gernsback lost control of the publication through various financial dealings and had to become the second publisher when he founded Air Wonder and Science Wonder in 1930. And they went on for a while before he got out of the field for a long time. Of course, now the awards at the World Science Fiction Convention, or Worldcon, are called the Hugos. That's because Gernsback promoted the idea, why don't you start a series of awards with my name on it? And so they decided, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. So they did it. He is noted for one thing. He added one word to our language, television. And that appeared in his 1909 novel, Ralph 124C41 Plus, a novel you would only read if you were really, really interested in the history of science fiction. But still, Greensback also had a ham television station back in the 20s, and the call signs for it were on the front covers of amazing stories. Okay, next. And by the way, if any of you have any questions you'd like to ask, my vision is not terribly good, so wave your hand frantically, and hopefully I will notice you and respond to your questions. All right. Here we have Edgar Rice Burroughs. He was a writer of entertainment, starting with Tarzan, Little Book, going on to John Carter of Mars, which Under the Moons of Mars appeared in 1912. So by the time the movie John Carter came out, it was 100 years old, and Burroughs' idea of a flying machine was actually a boat that flew. And, well, considering he wrote it only 9 years after Kitty Hawk, being a little late on how future flight would work was excusable. Burroughs had no axis to grind. He was writing entertainments, hoped to put no strain on the readers' minds. Yeah, pretty much his novels fell into a formula, with the John Carter. They started out in a flyer for someplace or other. They'd crash. Vegethoris would be captured. John Carter would have to rescue Vegethoris. Then they'd be captured by somebody else. He'd have to rescue again. It pretty much went on like that. It's surprising how entertaining they were, because, one thing Burroughs could really move a story. And he was financially quite successful, had a ranch in Tarzana. During World War II, he was the oldest accredited war correspondent in the Pacific Theater. So, which is how one of the Tarzan novels, Tarzan ends up fighting the Japanese. Okay, well, we're on to next. Why, in case you couldn't figure it out, the fellow on the left is not a science fiction writer. In fact, he's an Olympic swimmer and one of the best-known portrayers of Tarzan, Johnny Weissmuller. He's a man who pretty much made his entire career playing one character, Tarzan. And he did it pretty well, and he kept doing it until really, like in this photo, he's in quite good shape, but inevitably times go on. And we all get older, and so did he. So, all right, next. Okay. Here we have Murray Leinster. He was a science fiction writer before there were science fiction magazines. His first professional sale was in 1915. He published a very well-known story, The Runaway Skyscraper, before Amazing appeared. He wrote all sorts of comedy. He was a pulpster. And so he wrote mysteries and westerns and pirate stories and jungle stories. And, eventually Murray Leinster was a pseudonym. His actual name was Will F. Jenkins. And we're going to see one story marketed as a mystery under the Will F. Jenkins name called Murder of the USA. And that one, somebody had nuked the United States, and they couldn't figure out who. This was a 1947 novel, and maybe people were willing to accept that premise more than they would have later. He also, Black Galaxy. He adapted rather well, even for his very long career. He kept up with the times. Some other writers didn't manage to do that very so well. By the end of his career, he'd written 2 different novels titled Time Tunnel. One was an independent novel that he cooked up himself, and the other was from the TV series of the time. is D.E. Doc Smith, and he was the originator of the galactic epic, thud and blunder to the max. And this year, the London Worldcon is having some retro Hugo Awards for the fiction of 75 years ago. And this is something that has been done before. No awards were awarded, or no Hugos were awarded that year. The current Worldcon can do it for intervals of 25, 50, and 75 years. So 75 years ago, the Galactic Patrol appeared. The first is the Lensman series. And it was on a big scale, war across the entire galaxy, space battles, exotic aliens, fun stuff. There were weaknesses. I mean, the Lensman series is basically a conflict of absolute good against absolute evil. But every once in a while, the absolutely good started doing some rather questionable things, like wiping out whole species and things that are rather on the unfriendly side. But still colorful. The dialogue is awful. The model of Kimball Kinnison is a pure hero, which actually he gets away with things a little too easily. You want the bad guys to occasionally win something, because the Lensman series goes on for 6 volumes in which the good guys will win each and every encounter. And some of the things, when I thought about it, I reread this Galactic Patrol recently, and I had to think about it, but at the time D.E. Smith wrote that novel, our idea of the size of our galaxy was 1,000th of what it is today. They imagined a galaxy with maybe 100 million stars, which is a pretty fair size, but it's more like 100 billion. So his other major series was the Skylark of Space, which had several volumes to that. It was similar, and provoked Harry Harrison to do the parody Planet Smashers of the Galaxy Rangers, which, yes, the Rangers develop a super-duper drive that is powered by cheddar cheese, as I recall. That's Harry Harrison for you. One of his others was Bill the Galactic Hero, which parodied both Starship Troopers and Foundation. Okay, next.
Jack Williamson.
Yep, Jack Williamson. He's another writer of galactic epics, and one of his books is up for a retro Hugo, The Legion of Time, which in 1938 was rather a novel idea of 2 competing futures conducting a war in our time. And depending on which one wins, either the good future or the bad future eventuates. His other stories, he did The Legion of Space, which was again, an adventure on a very big canvas. In that series, it was 3 against the Legion and the Commandeers. But later, like Murray Leinster, he was able to develop. And one of his most mature novels is called The Humanoids, in which humanity develops android servants whose prime directive is to protect and serve and guard men from harm. And how they eventually exterminate the human race under that directive is the story. Because they would, when humans take no risks, they're going to become extinct rather rapidly. And quite a moving story, and Jack Williamson was still writing up into his 90s, and he was even on the Hugo ballot for when he was something like 93 years of age, and at that time was when he attended his last Worldcon. Okay.
What about darker than you think? darker than you think was a Williamson novel?
Yeah. And let's see, Reign of Wizardry. I think that was from Unknown Worlds, which I'll mention more when we get to John Campbell. Okay, next. And we have Frederick Poul. He was a member of the Futurians. He has the distinction of having been not allowed to Worldcon, along with Don Wollheim and some of his other communist friends decided they'd be disruptive, and so they were kept out of it. Poul's association with the Communist Party went up to 1940, and in his autobiography, he said that, I drank a toast to the liberation of Paris by the German army and realized I could no longer be a communist. And by that time he was into sound editing. His first ever was like an astonishing, sort of a bottom-of-the-line pulp magazine. But he got some of his Futurian buddies to write for it also, like Don Wollheim and C.N. Cornblood and some of the others. The Futurian Society, despite the fact that it never had more than 25 members and only really existed for 2 years, there are major portions of 6 different books devoted to the activity of the Futurian Society of New York. Later, Fred Poul became an agent with the Dirk Wiley agency, which collapsed. We had quite a bit of financial loss for a number of people. So he was out of favor for a while. And he took over the editorial duties at Galaxy and If, and at one time he was publishing half of all the science fiction magazine. All was together. We'll forget the problems of the Dirk Wiley agency. His novels in his early 50s, he did, Gravy Planet, which was sort of an extension of advertising and consumer oriented society. Gladiator Ball was similar. At a later period, he went a year over Gateway, which was rather similar to the idea of Stargate, in that they find a transport system across the galaxy that was created by an earlier race known as the Ishi, but they disappeared. And so humans are trying to figure out the system and finding various things around the galaxy. But, okay, next. Here we have John W. Campbell Jr. He's one of the most central characters in the 20th century. He took over the editorial duties of Astounding in 1937. Previously, he had been a writer of pretty much the Thunder and Wonder school of science fiction. But as an editor, he started demanding more logical rigor out of his writers. And he also had a companion magazine, Unknown Worlds, which produced some very fine fantasy, because a lot of fantasy writers get a little sloppy with their magic. Campbell wouldn't allow it. It had to make logical sense. You had to postulate how your magic worked and stick to it. But so the period 1938 to 1942 is the golden age of Astounding. People like Heinlein, Asimov, Sturgeon appeared during this period, and it was a very impressive time. It got sort of interrupted by World War II, and many of the people who were writing were suddenly in the military or in war work or one sort or another. But at one time, when I was a young man, I would have maintained that half of all the good science fiction ever entitled The Good Doctor, Isaac Asimov. It's been pointed out that, people who write humor tend to be rather not somber, at least restrained in their private life. And sometimes the reverse is true. People who write serious stories tend to be sort of upbeat in private life. And The Good Doctor was quite upbeat. In his career, he wrote over 300 books. Most of them popularized science. The Foundation series was one of his, it was his most famous series, when they give the best series of all time. Aside from popular science, he also wrote guides to the Bible, Shakespeare, Gilbert and Sullivan, a book on telling jokes. His volume series on the Bible I found it quite useful because he sort of wrote it for a person who didn't have a particularly religious background, and he expected many of his readers wouldn't. And thus he explained more things than you presume you came from one particular denomination. We'll repeat next. Okay, this is Robert Heinlein, and our order is sort of strange. This particular, he didn't usually sit around in the bathroom. But this photo is from the 1962 World Cup in Seattle. And he was guest of honor at that convention, and his approach to being a guest of honor was different than any others. He rented himself a suite and threw a party for the entire convention, for the entire 5 days, basically. And it was a small Worldcon. Back then, Worldcons were only a few hundred people. Seattle was 300. So it wasn't that big, but yes, you could, get quite well acquainted, of course. Heinlein has been referred to as the dean of science fiction. And a new writer would be hard-pressed to find a theme that Robert Heinlein didn't deal with somewhere. And some of his work became controversial, like Starship Troopers, although one that you know. He ended his Winston Juvenile series, which was quite successful, and many people, their first introduction to science fiction, novels like Red Planet, seem to attract a lot of them. And most of his juveniles are still quite real. Because he went on, actually, Starship Troopers got him banned in Italy for promoting fascism. Started lots of arguments of whether it was fascist or not. But considered that Heinlein was an old style naval officer. I think he graduated Annapolis in like 34. There we go. My head was continue moving, honest. All right. And he went on his later novels. All right. He reached the point where he could write a novel, put it in a sealed envelope, and get representatives from the publishers to come by. And he could simply say, okay, opening bid is $1 million. No, you don't get to read it first. And they came up with $1 million. And they probably made it back. But due to the fact that he was beyond editing, some of his later novels wandered all over the place, became very talky, very idiosyncratic, and so maybe not up to some his earlier works. In the recent past, the guy named Bill Patterson has done a 2-volume series on the life of Robert Heinlein, and they are very large, 2 very large volumes, so it may be more than you ever wanted to know about the life of Robert Heinlein, but I'm fairly sure, and I've also heard, that it's a very, very thorough job. And let's see if we have any more slides here, because we're back. Okay, Henry Cutner. Now, he was a fellow. In fact, one of Cutner's stories I have a story about. Okay, at one point, Robert Heinlein was visiting in LA, and I was giving him a ride. And we were going down Laurel Canyon Boulevard, the San Fernando Valley. And I commented that Henry Cutner had written a story called Compliments of the Author, in which the character was chased across Laurel Canyon Boulevard through the hills by a demon. And he said, yeah, Cutler was living at my house at the time, Heinlein's, and Heinlein was living up at Laurel Canyon. And that's where Cutler got the idea. And yes, if we were going to be chased by a demon, I really wouldn't want to be chased across Laurel Canyon. Yeah, Cutner was in Los Angeles at various times. He was a very prolific writer. In fact, he was so prolific that he generated a tremendous number of pseudonyms, to the point if any new writer showed up and you didn't know he was a real person, you'd presume he was Henry Cutler. And in many cases that was correct. But there was another writer, Jack Vance, who became a very major writer, but the Library Journal published as fact that Jack Vance was a pseudonym of Henry Cutler. So for the next 10 years, libraries across the United States filed Vance's novels under K. And their error was that, yes, Cutler had used Gerald Vance as a pseudonym, not Jack Vance. But yeah, very versatile writer, and unfortunately not a long-lived writer. He had a heart defect that kept him out of World War II, and he died in 1958. Okay, next. Now this is Henry Cutner with Catherine L. Moore, his wife. And they had met professionally. She'd done stories like Shambleau, which was a very notable story, and others. They began corresponding, and he had no idea that she was a female. When they finally met in person and he found out, they were married the next year, so apparently it wasn't a bad discovery on his part. But after that, everything they wrote was pretty much a collaboration, and they were quite a productive pair. One of her solo novels was a thing called Judgment Night, which I remember, it was sort of the inverse situation to Star Wars. In Judgment Night, the Galactic Princess and a cadre of army officers are trying to stop a peace movement with the rebels. In fact, she and her associates are going to assassinate the head of the rebellion when he comes to negotiate. She tries frying him and ends up singeing her own eyebrows. She found out he was wearing body armor and became a little irate that he didn't trust her. But after that, things developed. Rather interesting book. And she went on, after Henry Cutler's death, to write episodes for Maverick. She did a fair number of those. I also taught short story writing at USC for a couple of years. Okay, next. And this is Leigh Brackett. And
Yes.
she is a writer of two-fisted adventure stories. And I remember a quote from her rifle is as tough as any man ever born. Which is certainly a point. And she wrote about two-fisted male characters, or female characters weren't exactly cupcakes either. In films, she wrote Rio Bravo with John Wayne, The Big Sleep with Humphrey Bogart. Her last screen credit was the Empire Strikes Back. That interchange between Han Solo and Princess Leia of I Love You, Han, I Know, is very much Leigh Brackett sort of material. And breaking into movies, actually, when she was hired to write this screenplay for Rio Bravo, the producer knew what sort of copy she wrote, wanted her on the job, and, so sent me Leigh Brackett. So, a slender woman in her 40s walks in and went, "You're Leigh Brackett?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Oh, no problem." Just he hadn't been aware of that. And although she did a lot of, as I say, action adventure writing, her protege, Ray Bradbury, broke into the women's slips for the entire different stage, or type of writing. I heard her say that, well, initially, what you had to do with Ray Bradbury's fiction was just eat the purple out of it. But there's one case in which she was halfway through a novelette for Planet Stories, and she suddenly got a call from Hollywood, which made much more money. And she said, "Okay, Ray, finish this off and do something with it." And so he did, and it came out as a collaboration, Lorelei the Red Mist. You have Leigh Brackett's solid plotting and, along with Ray Bradbury's more poetic prose. It's an interesting blend. And it worked pretty well. Okay. Speaking of Ray Bradbury, Ray Bradbury. Now, with the Retro Hugos this year from 1938, Ray Bradbury hadn't sold any fiction by 1938, but he was publishing stories and fanzines. And so he is up for the Best Fan Writer Retro Hugo. The only problem with that is that Bradbury was an awful fan writer. In fact, to this day, it's pretty much a rule in the traditional fanzines, don't submit amateur fiction. If you can't sell it, we don't want to read it. And that comes largely from Bradbury, who generated thousands of really not very good efforts of fiction before he finally started selling. And unfortunately, his best period, late 40s, early 50s, and after that he became an example that becoming a famous writer is difficult. Being a famous writer is fairly easy. And he continued morphing into a poet, although honestly, in my own opinion, his poetry was nothing to write home about. But very successful and broke some new ground for the science fiction field. Next.
Milt, we have about 10 minutes and 10 writers left. So,
All right. Judith Merrill. You can figure out which one's Judith Merrill, can't you? Yeah. She was an editor and writer. Wrote stuff that could be more identified with a female writer, because both C.L. Moore and Leigh Brackett were writing earlier, but they tended to write, action adventure. And she later migrated to Toronto, and donated her collection background. He wasn't a writer, but is, the boss of the science fiction field. He was the publisher and editor of Locus, the newspaper of the science fiction field. And Charlie was a guy you didn't want to cross because you really annoyed him. He could just not review your books forever, and that would have an impact. Okay, next. Poul Anderson, really swell guy. He and his wife Karen used to throw some great parties at their place in the Bay Area, 3 Las Palomas, Orinda. I remember attending some of them, and at the end of the party, everybody else was pretty much annihilated. And Poul and Karen would still be sitting, just talking quietly. Poul he started writing when he was in college, wrote a lot of material. He had his own future history, as Heinlein did, and much of it featuring Nick Van Ryn and his employees, the Trader team, and later the Terran Empire with Sir Dominic Flandry. I'd say Poul Anderson is my favorite science fiction writer. He had a blend of art, science, humor, and romanticism that I found very pleasing combination. Okay, next. This is Philip K. Dick. He became well known for things like Man in the High Castle. He became Hollywood's favorite sci-fi writer with Blade Runner, Total Recall, Imposter, and some others. There's a theme under much of his fiction that you can't trust your own mind. Well, he couldn't trust his own mind. He spent most of his life in and out of mental institutions, and taking a lot of drugs didn't help. I don't know whether I was corrupted with fandom or that I could see something insane in his work, but I just never got very enthusiastic about his work. On one occasion, I was sitting on a bar stool next to him. I didn't want to talk to him. I didn't want to know him. And for all his other activities, being a person of dubious sanity, I didn't lose anything by not knowing him. Next. Oh, well, if you want some stories, I can tell you why I love that one. And this is Arthur C. Clarke. 2001, The Space Odyssey. He was a fan before, and a scientist before he started writing science fiction. 2001 was from a fairly minor short story of his called Salon that appeared in a very minor pulp magazine. One of his biggest contributions was in an article in 1948. He proposed the idea of a communications satellite by hanging the satellite with in geosynchronous orbit. He did not have the thing totally thought out. He was thinking of a manned space station where they would, swap vacuum tubes. But as a result, that type of an orbit is called the Clarke orbit this day. He wrote, When the Ego for Fountains of Paradise, Rendezvous with Brahma. He did a lot of quite good science fiction. Okay, next. Well, this probably is the last one. Would have been an entry. This is Andre Morton. She wrote a great many novels in a category that was called juveniles at the time, that would now be called young adults. Probably find her books in every junior high school library in the country. And she was, many people got their introduction to science fiction through her books. She lived in Florida. She had medical problems, so she never traveled very much. There was one convention in Florida she made it to, but that was about it. Next. Vonnegut. Now, one thing, he never got very far into the science fiction field. He hasn't sold very popular novels. He never sold to Campbell, who he didn't like much. In Slaughterhouse-Five and Mother Night, there's an American Nazi named Howard W. Campbell Jr. And that was close enough that I'm sort of surprised that Vonnegut didn't get himself sued, but he didn't. I don't know. Anybody who ever met him didn't seem to want to repeat the experience, so I don't know that much of him. I know what he wrote, and that's about it. Next. And here we have Frank Herbert, Dune. And that was a blockbuster that sort of exceeded most blockbusters. In many conventions, I've done a program. The biggest program I ever did was for the 1984 Worldcon. My biggest function room could seat 1,500. And I had a program, Frank Herbert, talking about the forthcoming movie version of Dune, filled up the entire room, standing room only. And, after that, it's too bad that the writers, they get their cash cow, and it's good for them, but after that, like Anna McCaffrey with the Dragon Riders, Roger Zelazny with Amber, they continue to milk their cash cow. And for Frank Herbert, Dune was it. His son is still turning out Dune novels this many years later. Okay, next. Here is Marion Zimmer Bradley. She's about to be purged from the field altogether. She was involved in a scandal years ago because her husband was a child molester and convicted of child molesting, and this is due to her reputation. But now, 50 years later, some people are digging up more stuff that she molested her children and things of this sort. They say she's been dead for 15 years, but that's sort of the internet sort of thing these days, digging things up. Okay, next. Bob Runner. And this is at the 77 Worldcon in Orlando. And this is a crab feast. And I describe Runner as an amiable blonde for blonde. I really dug his velvet suits. And yeah, he was quite a popular fellow in British fandom and in the United States. Staying on Zanzibar, on the Hugo, probably his best-known novel, a different approach in that it isn't about one group of characters, it's about a society and various snapshots of it that sort of fit together in the picture of a future world. Okay, next.
Last
This is
one.
Octavia Butler, Los Angeles resident. One of her most successful stories was set on a bus in Los Angeles. The story was called Speech Sounds, in which humans have lost the ability to talk or to understand words. You can still think, but most humans can't talk and just growl at each other, but still know how to keep things running, sort of. And yeah, she grew up in South Central LA. Once she got some money, she got as close to the Pacific Ocean as she could be without getting her feet wet. Okay, next.
No, that's it.
That's it.
That's it.
All right, any questions, sir?
Go ahead.
I have my own answers to this, but what have you got against Carlin Ellison?
He's not dead.
Oh, that's right. Well, I agree with you.
Great straight line, you know. Really, I know nothing particularly against Harlan, and I don't wish her to be
I
dead.
totally forgot about the dead part.
Okay.
My mistake. I don't wish him.
Oh, is there a question here?
You should look over there too.
Theodore Sturgeon.
Interesting. All right, there are a number of other ones. Why we didn't include him? Fritz Leiber, Clifford Simak, Theodore Sturgeon, Roger Zelazny. There was some pressure of why are there all these men? Well, they were the same thing. They just could have been otherwise. It could have been many ways.
I want everyone to give a round of applause. For the stories. And some people want to hear the story behind why you don't care about what filming it. It is 10 minutes to 1. We're going to take a 15-minute break. Craig, are you ready? Okay, we're going to come back in 15 minutes and we're going to get started on Jack Parsons' science fiction, rocket science, and black magic. Alistair Poul. So, we'll be right here. We'll see you back.